Hello and welcome to the COMLEX Instant Review. Let's review some biostatistics. What is the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis is basically testing whether or not there is no association between the disease and the risk factor in the population. So the hypothesis of no difference is the null hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis, H1, is the hypothesis that there is some difference. In other words, there is some association between the disease and the risk factor in the population. So just to recap, the null hypothesis is testing whether or not there is no association between the disease and the risk factor. And the alternate hypothesis is testing whether there is some association between the disease and the risk factor. Now, there's several types of errors that can come into play, and you have to understand these. Type 1 error, also known as the alpha error, this is stating that there is an effect or difference when actually none exists. And so you mistakenly accept the experimental hypothesis and you're rejecting the null hypothesis. Because remember, the null hypothesis says that there is no difference, and the alternative hypothesis is saying that there is some association between the disease and the risk factor in the population. The p-value is the probability of making a type 1 error. The p-value is judged against alpha, a preset level of significance, usually less than 0.05. And again, it's also known as the false positive error. So if the p-value on the board question is less than 0.05, then there is less than a 5% chance that the data will show something that is not really there. Okay, so alpha is actually a measure of what you saw in terms of a difference that really did not exist. For example, convicting an innocent man is considered to be alpha. Okay, so just to review some of the key points. On the board exam question, if the p-value given to you in the question is less than 0.05, then there is less than a 5% chance that the data will show something that is not really there. Okay, so the type 1 error comes into play when there is an effect or difference when actually none really exists. So you mistakenly accept the experimental hypothesis and you reject the null hypothesis. What does the type 2 error, also known as beta error, mean? Well, beta is the probability of making a type 2 error. This is known as the false negative error, and what happens here is you're stating that there is not an effect or difference when actually one exists. So you fail to reject the null hypothesis when in fact H0 is false. So remember, what you mistakenly do here is you fail to reject the null hypothesis. That's the correct way to say it. So in beta, you did not see a difference that does exist. So there's a big difference between a type 1 error and a type 2 error. In the type 2 error, you're stating that there is not an effect or a difference when actually one exists. You fail to reject the null hypothesis. In a type 1 error, you're stating that there is an effect or difference when none actually exists, and you mistakenly accept the experimental hypothesis. What is power? Power is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact false, or the likelihood of finding a difference if one in fact exists. So if you increase the sample size, you increase power. And so there's powers in number. The power equals 1 minus beta, which is the probability of making a type 2 error. So just to recap, the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact false, or the likelihood of finding a difference if one in fact exists. So power is actually testing 1 minus the probability of making a type 2 error, because in a type 2 error you're stating that there is not an effect or difference when in fact there really exists one, and you fail to reject the null hypothesis. The power is testing the probability of actually rejecting the null hypothesis when it in fact is false. So in essence, it depends on the total number of endpoints experienced by the population. And also the difference in compliance between the treatment groups, the differences in the mean values between the groups, and the size of the expected effect. That was a quick COMLEX instant review for the COMLEX and USMLE board exam. Please visit comlexflashcards.com for additional podcasts, and good luck in your preparation for the boards.